April 2014, Cavite, Philippines. Gunshots shattered the quiet of a residential neighborhood in the middle of the night. When police arrived, they found one man deceased and his wife critically injured. The motive appeared straightforward, a home invasion robbery. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered something unexpected. The victim had been hiding 2 million pesos in cash, money that didn't belong to him. This is a story about a chance discovery, moral compromise, and how found fortune can become a fatal curse. Everyone dreams of suddenly coming into money, finding a winning lottery ticket, inheriting an unexpected fortune, or stumbling upon something valuable. It's a universal fantasy, the idea that financial struggles could end in an instant through sheer luck. But what happens when that fantasy becomes reality? More importantly, what happens when the money you find belongs to someone else? Ramil Alvarado was an ordinary man living an ordinary life in Tanza, Cavite. He worked modest jobs, supported his wife Sally and their teenage son, and like many families in their community, navigated the constant challenge of making ends meet. They weren't destitute, but they certainly weren't comfortable. Every peso was accounted for, every expense carefully considered. In February 2014, Ramil traveled to Manila to see off his sibling, an overseas Filipino worker heading to Kuwait for employment. A common story in the Philippines, where millions work abroad to support families back home. After the airport farewell, Ramil caught a taxi for the journey back to Cavite, exhausted and eager to return home. During the ride, something caught his attention, a bulge on the floor behind the front passenger seat. Glancing down, he noticed a black bag partially concealed beneath the seat. His initial reaction was to ignore it. Perhaps another passenger had left it. Maybe the driver knew about it. But as the taxi approached the bus terminal where he'd transfer for the final leg home, curiosity overwhelmed caution. Before exiting the taxi, Ramil grabbed the bag and concealed it under his jacket. His heart pounded as he walked to the bus, the weight of the bag both physical and psychological. He knew taking it was wrong, but rationalization came easily. Finders keepers, he told himself. If he didn't take it, someone else would. The owner was careless to leave it behind. Once safely aboard the bus bound for Cavite, Ramil couldn't resist examining his find. Opening the bag in his seat, he discovered something that would change his life irrevocably. Bundles of cash wrapped in rubber bands. More money than he'd ever seen in one place. Even without careful counting, he recognized the amount was substantial, easily in the hundreds of thousands of pesos, possibly more. His palms began sweating. His pulse accelerated. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings. This money belonged to someone who would certainly be searching for it, someone who might be dangerous. But another voice, louder and more seductive, painted different pictures. A new house, a car, a business, security for his family, an end to financial anxiety. Throughout the bus ride, Ramil kept the bag close, avoiding eye contact with other passengers, convinced everyone could somehow sense what he was carrying. Possibilities raced through his mind, each more tempting than the last. By the time he arrived home safely, he'd made a decision. He would keep the money. That night, he barely slept. The bag sat hidden in their bedroom, while competing emotions battled in his consciousness. Excitement about newfound wealth versus fear of consequences. Justification that he deserved this stroke of luck versus guilt about taking something that wasn't his. The following morning, unable to contain himself, Ramil revealed the discovery to Sally. Her reaction was immediate shock, followed by concern. As they counted the money together, the total reached 2 million pesos, an astronomical sum for their household, equivalent to years of savings they'd never managed to accumulate. Sally's instinct was straightforward: return the money or report it to police. This wasn't their property, she argued. Someone was desperately searching for it. Keeping it was not only morally wrong but dangerous. What if the owner came looking? What if the money was connected to criminal activity? But Ramil had already crossed an internal threshold. To him, this wasn't stolen property. It was a blessing. Divine intervention, ending their years of financial struggle. He dismissed Sally's concerns with rationalizations. If they surrendered it to police, there was no guarantee it would reach the rightful owner. Corrupt officers might pocket it themselves. Against Sally's protests, Ramil hid the black bag beneath their old dresser, ensuring it wouldn't be easily discovered. He'd made his decision, and no amount of reasoning from his wife would change his mind. The money, he convinced himself, was theirs now, a stroke of fortune that would finally lift them from their perpetual financial struggles. What began as small, cautious expenditures quickly escalated into conspicuous consumption. Initially, Ramil justified modest purchases: better groceries, new clothes for their son, paying off accumulated debts to neighbors and small creditors. These seemed reasonable, the kind of improvements any family experiencing a windfall might make. But money, particularly unearned money, has a peculiar psychological effect. It creates a sense of invincibility, a belief that the rules governing ordinary financial responsibility no longer apply. Within days, Ramil's spending became bolder, his restraint evaporating as quickly as the cash in that black bag. The most visible symbol of their sudden wealth appeared within a week: a second-hand SUV parked prominently in front of their modest home. In their neighborhood, where most families relied on public transportation or motorcycles, an SUV was a status symbol, an unmistakable declaration of upward mobility. Neighbors noticed immediately. Questions circulated. Where did Ramil get money for a vehicle? Had he won the lottery? Received inheritance from a wealthy relative? Gotten a lucrative overseas contract? Ramil offered vague explanations: an installment plan through a friend, a good deal he couldn't pass up. Some accepted these explanations. Others remained skeptical. The vehicle purchase opened a floodgate. Ramil began hosting nightly gatherings, inviting friends and acquaintances for drinking sessions that stretched into early morning hours. What had once been simple affairs with cheap beer and basic snacks transformed into elaborate parties with expensive alcohol and catered food. Ramil played the generous host, always covering expenses, always insisting on another round. These gatherings served multiple purposes psychologically. They validated his newfound status, positioning him as someone who'd made it, someone whose success deserved celebration. They also provided social camouflage. If he was spending openly, perhaps people would assume his wealth was legitimate, rather than questioning its origins. Their small house began filling with consumer goods: new appliances, a flat-screen television, expensive mobile phones. Each purchase brought temporary satisfaction, a brief high that quickly faded, demanding another purchase to recreate that feeling. This cycle, acquisition, fleeting joy, renewed desire, is characteristic of what psychologists call hedonic adaptation, where material improvements quickly become the new baseline rather than sources of lasting happiness. Sally watched this transformation with growing dread. Each expenditure deepened her anxiety. Each party amplified her fear that attention was being drawn to their family. She tried repeatedly to reason with Ramil, warning him that someone would eventually come looking for the money, that their sudden lifestyle change was attracting dangerous notice. Their conversations deteriorated into arguments. Ramil accused her of being ungrateful, of wanting to return to poverty when opportunity had finally arrived. Sally countered that stolen fortune was no blessing. It was a curse waiting to manifest. But Ramil, intoxicated by both literal alcohol and the metaphorical intoxication of wealth, couldn't hear her warnings. The neighborhood buzz intensified. At the corner store, at community gatherings, in private conversations, people speculated about the Alvarado family's sudden prosperity. The theories ranged from mundane to fantastical: lottery winnings, remittances from abroad, involvement in illegal activities, or perhaps Ramil had discovered some lucrative business opportunity. But underlying the gossip was a more dangerous current: jealousy, mixed with suspicion. In close-knit communities, sudden, unexplained wealth creates social friction. It disrupts established hierarchies and generates resentment among those still struggling. More critically, it attracts attention from individuals who view others' good fortune as potential opportunity for themselves. During these drinking sessions, Ramil's tongue loosened with each bottle. Alcohol has a way of eroding discretion, making people share information they'd otherwise guard carefully. While he never explicitly stated where the money came from, he dropped hints, made oblique references, and exhibited the swagger of someone sitting on a secret that made him feel clever and fortunate. These indiscretions would prove catastrophic. Among the friends and acquaintances joining these parties was someone paying particular attention, not celebrating Ramil's good fortune, but calculating, observing, and planning. Saturday night, April 26, 2014. Most of the neighborhood had settled into sleep when a violent disturbance shattered the quiet around midnight. Neighbors heard loud banging, then gunshots, multiple rounds fired in rapid succession. Screams for help echoed briefly before fading into ominous silence. No one emerged from their homes. In communities where violence occasionally erupts, self-preservation often overrides the impulse to help. People locked their doors, turned off lights, and waited for the commotion to subside, hoping whatever was happening wouldn't spread to their own households. The chaos originated from the Alvarado residence, the same house that had hosted so many celebrations in recent weeks. When police finally arrived and entered the property, they discovered a scene of devastating violence. Ramil lay on the living room floor, fatally injured. Sally was found in another part of the house, wounded and barely conscious, her shoulders struck by gunfire. She was immediately rushed to a hospital where emergency medical intervention would ultimately save her life. Their teenage son, fortunately, had been staying with friends that evening, a stroke of luck that spared him from either witnessing the attack or potentially becoming another victim. He would return home to find his life irrevocably altered. His father deceased, his mother hospitalized, and his family's brief period of prosperity ended in tragedy. Initial assessments suggested a robbery gone wrong. Home invaders seeking valuables who encountered resistance and responded with lethal force. In communities where sudden displays of wealth attract criminal attention, such incidents aren't uncommon. Investigators began standard procedures, examining the crime scene, interviewing neighbors, and attempting to reconstruct events. But details emerged that complicated the straightforward robbery narrative. There was no evidence of forced entry from the exterior, suggesting the attackers either had keys or were admitted by someone inside. The violence appeared targeted rather than random. And most puzzling, why would robbers target the Alvarado family, who until recently had shown no signs of significant wealth? As investigators canvassed the neighborhood in subsequent days, they gathered fragments of information. Accounts of Ramil's recent lifestyle changes, the unexplained SUV purchase, the frequent parties, and the speculation about sudden wealth. This context suggested the attack wasn't opportunistic, but planned. Perpetrators who specifically knew the family possessed something valuable. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the incident, a 28-year-old man voluntarily approached authorities with information that would crack the case wide open. This witness revealed that days before the attack, someone named Tony had recruited him for a robbery operation. Tony hadn't explicitly named Ramil as the target, but had described a man who'd found a bag containing a large sum of money in Manila. The witness had declined to participate, but knew the plan was serious. His conscience, coupled with fear of being implicated as an accomplice, drove him to cooperate with investigators. This testimony provided the critical lead. Anthony "Tony" Basunas became the primary suspect. Within days, coordinated police operations resulted in Tony's arrest, along with 2 accomplices, captured in separate raids before they could flee or dispose of evidence. The arrests of Tony Basunas and his 2 accomplices marked a turning point in the investigation. What police recovered during these operations provided overwhelming evidence. A substantial portion of the stolen cash, items purchased with the money, and critically, the unlicensed firearms used during the attack. Ballistics analysis confirmed these weapons matched the ammunition recovered from the crime scene. Forensic evidence further cemented the case. Tony tested positive on paraffin testing, a procedure that detects gunshot residue on hands and clothing, indicating recent firearm discharge. Fingerprints found at the Alvarado residence matched those of the suspects. The physical evidence, combined with witness testimony, created an airtight prosecutorial case. Faced with irrefutable proof, Tony provided a full confession. His account revealed the tragic irony underlying this entire case, how Ramil's own indiscretion had sealed his fate. According to Tony's statement, he wasn't particularly close to the Alvarado family. Their connection was casual, the kind of neighborhood acquaintanceship that develops through occasional social interactions. However, 3 days before the attack, Tony had been invited to one of Ramil's drinking sessions, the gatherings that had become nightly occurrences at the Alvarado household. During this particular evening, as alcohol flowed and inhibitions lowered, Ramil made a critical error. In what may have been boastful pride or simple drunken carelessness, he shared the story of how he'd acquired his sudden wealth, finding a bag containing a massive amount of cash in a Manila taxi and deciding to keep it. He described the discovery with detail, the circumstances, the amount of money, where it was hidden in his house. Perhaps Ramil believed he was among friends, that sharing his secret would remain within a trusted circle. Perhaps the alcohol had simply impaired his judgment to the point where discretion was impossible. Regardless of motivation, the disclosure was catastrophic. Tony heard this confession differently than Ramil intended. Rather than seeing a friend's good fortune, he saw opportunity. A large sum of money, illegally obtained, meaning the victim couldn't report theft to authorities, stored in a home with minimal security. The criminal calculus was straightforward. Ramil had essentially advertised himself as a perfect target. In his confession, Tony claimed the original plan involved theft without violence. They would break in, take the money, and leave. A property crime rather than a violent confrontation. This is a common rationalization among criminals who want to view themselves as principled thieves rather than dangerous predators. Whether this claim was genuine or self-serving justification remains unclear. What's certain is that when they executed the robbery late that Saturday night, circumstances deviated from whatever plan existed. When confronted by 3 armed, masked intruders, Ramil didn't comply passively. Despite being disadvantaged, outnumbered, unarmed, partially intoxicated from earlier drinking, he resisted. He attempted to fight back, to prevent them from taking the bag he'd guarded so carefully for 2 months. This resistance transformed a robbery into something far deadlier. In the chaos of physical struggle, with adrenaline surging and control eroding, violence escalated rapidly. Gunshots were fired. Ramil was fatally wounded. Sally, attempting to help her husband, was struck in the shoulder. The assailants grabbed what they could and fled into the night on a motorcycle without license plates, leaving carnage behind them. The speed of the incident, from forced entry to fatal shooting, to escape, likely took only minutes, perhaps less. But those minutes represented the culmination of a chain of events set in motion months earlier, when Ramil made that initial decision in a Manila taxi. 1 week after the attack, Ramil was laid to rest. Sally, recovering from her gunshot wound in the hospital, faced not only physical trauma, but profound emotional devastation. She'd warned her husband repeatedly that the money would bring disaster. Her intuition had been correct, but that validation provided no comfort, only the bitter knowledge that tragedy had been preventable. Sally later expressed that her greatest regret wasn't simply that Ramil had taken the money, but that she hadn't been more forceful in her opposition. She wondered whether she should have contacted police herself, hidden the bag, or taken more drastic action to protect her family from her husband's dangerous choices. With the perpetrators in custody and their confessions documented, investigators turned their attention to a question that had been secondary during the manhunt, but was now critically important. Who actually owned the 2 million pesos that had triggered this tragedy? The black bag recovered from Tony and his accomplices still contained a significant portion of the original cash. Ramil hadn't spent everything, and the robbers hadn't had time to disperse the money before their arrests. More importantly, the bag contained a crucial clue that investigators had overlooked initially: a hospital receipt bearing the name Milagros Abad. This small piece of paper, something Ramil likely never noticed or dismissed as unimportant, became the key to solving the mystery of the bag's origin. Police traced the name, located Milagros Abad's family, and invited them to the station to potentially claim the recovered property. What emerged was a story far more poignant than investigators anticipated. The person who arrived at the police station was Milagros's adult child, a Filipino citizen based in Canada, who had returned to the Philippines several months earlier under heartbreaking circumstances. Milagros was suffering from severe kidney disease, requiring urgent medical intervention, dialysis treatments, and eventually a transplant operation. Healthcare in the Philippines, particularly for serious conditions requiring specialized treatment, demands substantial upfront payment. Insurance coverage is often limited, and families must shoulder enormous financial burdens. The 2 million pesos in that bag represented desperate fundraising for a mother's life-saving medical care. The money had been obtained through loans, contributions from family members abroad, and possibly the sale of assets. Everything this family could mobilize to pay for treatments scheduled for the following month. The loss of that bag had been catastrophic for them. Beyond the obvious financial devastation, it had jeopardized Milagros's treatment timeline. They'd filed reports with taxi companies and police, searched desperately, and faced the agonizing prospect of watching their mother's condition deteriorate while being unable to afford intervention. When police contacted them with news that the money had been recovered, their relief was complicated by learning the circumstances: that someone had found their bag, kept it, spent a significant portion, and ultimately died because of it. The emotional complexity of this revelation, gratitude for recovery, mixed with horror at the consequences, must have been overwhelming. During the meeting at the police station, Milagros's child displayed remarkable grace under circumstances that might have provoked rage or bitterness. Rather than demanding maximum prosecution or expressing satisfaction at Ramil's fate, they chose a more compassionate response. After recovering the remaining cash and the SUV Ramil had purchased with their money, assets totaling approximately 1.6 million pesos once everything was accounted for, they made an extraordinary gesture. They left 20,000 pesos for Sally and her son. This amount wasn't substantial in the context of what had been lost, but it was profoundly significant symbolically. It acknowledged that while Ramil bore responsibility for taking their money, his widow and child were also victims, left without a husband and father, traumatized by violence, and facing their own uncertain future. The decision to provide this assistance rather than seeking to punish the Alvarado family further, or simply walking away with what could be recovered, reflected deep empathy. It recognized the shared humanity in this situation, two families devastated by different aspects of the same tragic sequence of events. For Sally, receiving this money must have evoked complex emotions. Shame that her family had caused such suffering to strangers, gratitude for compassion she likely felt they didn't deserve, and perhaps relief that someone understood she and her son were casualties rather than beneficiaries of Ramil's choices. The recovered funds, while substantially depleted from the original amount, were enough for Milagros to receive her treatments. Her family could proceed with the medical care that had been jeopardized, offering at least some positive resolution to their nightmare. This element of the case, the revelation of who owned the money and why it mattered so desperately, transformed the narrative from a simple crime story into something more profound. The money Ramil saw as fortunate windfall was actually another family's pooled resources for survival. His gain was their catastrophic loss, his temporary prosperity, their mother's endangered life. The criminal proceedings against Tony Basunas and his accomplices moved forward through the Philippine justice system. By 2016, verdicts were delivered, and the legal consequences for their actions became final. Tony, as the primary perpetrator who had planned the robbery and participated in the violent home invasion, received the harshest sentence. He was convicted of robbery with homicide, a capital offense in Philippine criminal law that combines property crime with the taking of human life. Additionally, he faced charges of robbery resulting in physical injuries for the harm inflicted on Sally. The court sentenced Tony to reclusion perpetua, which translates to life imprisonment with a minimum of 25 years before any possibility of parole consideration. This severe penalty reflected both the gravity of his actions and the aggravating circumstances. The crime was premeditated, involved weapons, resulted in death, and targeted a home where victims had reasonable expectation of safety. His two accomplices, while also convicted, received somewhat reduced sentences as participants rather than the primary instigator. Each was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment for robbery charges. Philippine criminal law allows for such distinctions, recognizing degrees of culpability, even among co-conspirators. These sentences provided a measure of legal closure, though they couldn't restore what was lost: Ramil's life, Sally's sense of security, their son's intact family, or the months of anguish Milagros's family experienced while their medical funds were missing. For Sally, the verdicts brought complex feelings rather than simple satisfaction. Justice had been served in the formal legal sense. Her husband's killers were imprisoned, unable to harm others. Yet this justice couldn't address her deeper grief, and the knowledge that this entire tragedy stemmed from a decision Ramil made months earlier in a Manila taxi. She'd survived physically, the bullet wound in her shoulder healing with time. But psychological wounds remained. Trauma from the attack, survivor's guilt about living while her husband died, and the burden of raising their son alone, while processing the complicated legacy Ramil had left behind. Their son faced perhaps the most difficult emotional terrain. He'd lost his father not to illness, accident, or senseless random violence, but to consequences that flowed directly from his father's choices. How does one mourn a parent while simultaneously grappling with the reality that their poor judgment precipitated their own death? The community's response to the Alvarado family evolved as details emerged. Initial sympathy for victims of violent crime became complicated by understanding of the backstory. Some neighbors expressed the view that while Ramil's death was tragic, he'd created the conditions for it. Others maintained that regardless of his mistakes, no one deserves such violence. This divided response reflects broader tensions in how communities process moral complexity. the tendency to want clear villains and victims, rather than acknowledging situations where someone can be both. A victim of violence, who created vulnerability through wrongdoing. The case became cautionary folklore in the neighborhood, referenced when discussing integrity, temptation, and consequences. Parents would cite it when teaching children about honesty. Remember what happened to the man who kept money that wasn't his? This case invites examination of a deceptively simple moral question. What obligation do we have when finding something valuable that belongs to someone else? Most people would claim they do the right thing, yet research on human behavior suggests reality is far more complicated. Psychologists have studied what they call found property dilemmas extensively. Studies reveal that decision-making in these situations involves rapid moral calculation influenced by multiple factors. The value of the item, likelihood of identification and return to the owner, presence of witnesses, and critically, how easily we can rationalize keeping it. Ramil's situation embodied several elements that made keeping the money psychologically easier to justify. First, the discovery occurred in relative privacy, a taxi with only the driver present, who appeared unaware of the bag. Second, the money was cash, rather than identifiable property like a wallet with ID or a phone with contact information. This anonymity made the victim abstract rather than personal. Third, and perhaps most significantly, Ramil was experiencing financial stress, the condition that makes temptation most powerful. Research consistently shows that people facing economic hardship are more likely to rationalize keeping found money, viewing it as karmic compensation for their struggles, rather than someone else's loss. The psychological phenomenon of moral licensing also played a role. Ramil likely viewed himself as generally honest. He worked legitimate jobs, supported his family, wasn't involved in criminal activity. This self-concept as a good person paradoxically made it easier to justify this one transgression. He could tell himself, "I'm not a thief, I just got lucky once." What Ramil failed to consider, what most people in his situation fail to consider, is the ripple effects of such decisions. The money wasn't abstract. It belonged to a specific family facing a medical crisis. His lucky find was their catastrophe. Every peso he spent on luxuries was money unavailable for someone's mother's dialysis treatments. This disconnection between action and consequence is what philosophers call moral distance. When we don't see the person we're harming, when the consequences aren't immediate and visible, it's psychologically easier to proceed with harmful actions. Had Ramil known Milagros was dying without access to treatment because of his decision, would he have acted differently? Possibly, though temptation's power shouldn't be underestimated. The spending pattern Ramil exhibited after keeping the money reveals another psychological principle: hot money effect. Studies show that money acquired through windfalls, gambling, or other easy means tends to be spent more frivolously than earned income. People become less careful with money they didn't work for, treating it as bonus resources rather than wealth requiring stewardship. This explains Ramil's rapid escalation from small purchases to extravagant spending. The SUV, the nightly parties, the expensive gifts. The money felt free, limitless, and he spent accordingly. Had he acquired 2 million pesos through years of saving, he would have treated it very differently, guarding it carefully and spending judiciously. The role of alcohol in Ramil's downfall deserves attention. His loose tongue during drinking sessions, revealing the source of his wealth to acquaintances, represents a common pattern where intoxication erodes judgment about what information should remain private. Alcohol doesn't just impair physical coordination. It dismantles the psychological filters that protect us from our own indiscretions. As we conclude this examination of Ramil Alvarado's tragic story, several profound lessons emerge, insights that extend far beyond this specific case. The most fundamental lesson is elegantly simple yet difficult to practice. Property that doesn't belong to you should be returned, regardless of how desperately you want or need it. This principle isn't merely legal compliance, it's recognition that our actions have consequences for real people facing real struggles we cannot see. Had Ramil made different choices at key decision points, multiple lives would have followed entirely different trajectories. If he'd left the bag in the taxi, or immediately turned it over to authorities, Milagros's family would have recovered their medical funds. Ramil would still be alive. Sally wouldn't carry physical and emotional scars. Their son would have an intact family. Instead, one decision, made in seconds, rationalized quickly, and acted upon impulsively, set in motion a cascade of events that destroyed multiple lives. This is the nature of moral choices. They appear small in the moment, but carry consequences vastly disproportionate to the time required to make them. The case also illustrates how found money, rather than solving financial problems, often creates catastrophic new ones. Ramil's 2 months of relative prosperity cost him his life, traumatized his family, and resulted in losing most of the money anyway. The temporary comfort wasn't worth the permanent price. For those facing financial stress, which describes most people at various life stages, this case offers a critical reminder. Legitimate solutions exist for economic hardship. Ramil could have worked additional jobs, sought assistance from community organizations, applied for government support programs, or accepted his family's current economic status while working gradually toward improvement. These paths are harder and slower than finding 2 million pesos, but they don't end in violent death. Sally's experience provides another lesson about the limitations of spousal influence. She correctly identified the danger, articulated clear warnings, and repeatedly urged Ramil to return the money. Yet, she couldn't force compliance, couldn't override his decision-making authority within their household. This reflects the reality that we cannot control other adults' choices, even when we love them and can clearly see they're headed toward disaster. Her survival carries its own burden, living with the knowledge that she was right, that the tragedy was preventable, and that her warnings were ignored. This represents a particular kind of grief, mourning not just what was lost, but what could have been avoided. For the perpetrators, Tony Bazunas and his accomplices, this case demonstrates how quickly criminal opportunity can present itself, and how devastating the consequences of acting on that opportunity become. Tony heard about money during a casual drinking session, and within days had planned and executed a robbery that resulted in life imprisonment. A few hours of poor decision-making will cost him decades behind bars. The compassion shown by Milagros's family, leaving money for Sally despite everything, offers perhaps the most powerful lesson of all. They recognized that additional punishment wouldn't restore what they'd lost, that Sally and her son were also victims, and that mercy costs nothing, while potentially healing much. The black bag that Ramil found in that Manila taxi was never a blessing. It was a test he failed catastrophically. It measured not his luck, but his character, and in failing that test, he paid with everything. The money that seemed like the solution to all his problems became the source of his destruction. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is also the right thing to do. And sometimes, what appears to be fortune is actually a curse waiting to reveal itself. That's what Ramil Alvarado learned, though the lesson cost him his life.